My friends, let us begin by acknowledging something very simple, yet profoundly overlooked in all the centuries of religious devotion. You have prayed your entire life. You have asked, pleaded, begged, hoped, and reached outward toward a God you believed was somewhere else, somewhere above, somewhere beyond, somewhere inaccessible unless you said the right words or held the proper faith. And yet, after all of that, you still believe that God must be persuaded. You still believe that prayer is a matter of convincing an external power to intervene in the affairs of your daily life. But I say to you today, as gently and as clearly as I know how, there is no God out there to be convinced. There is no external power waiting to be informed of your needs. The very moment you attempt to ask God for anything, you are unknowingly declaring that the divine presence has not already gone before you, has not already prepared the way, has not already fulfilled every requirement of your life. This, you see, is the reason prayer frustrates so many. Not because God is unwilling, nor because God is distant, nor because God is selective in his blessings. No prayer feels empty because it begins with a false premise that something is missing, that something must be added, that God must be awakened, stirred, or convinced, and as long as prayer begins in that state of separation, you will never discover its true purpose. Now listen closely. The kingdom of God is not a place to reach, but a presence to recognize. It is not attained by asking. It is revealed by awareness. When we speak of prayer in the infinite way, we are not speaking of reaching outward. We are speaking of turning within, of becoming still enough to behold the activity of the presence that has forever been functioning as your very life. And so I welcome you into this class, not to teach you how to get something from God, but to help you realize that nothing has ever been withheld. What we are learning here is not a technique for gaining favors, but a way of awakening to what is already established in spiritual consciousness. As we go forward today, we will discover why so many prayers appear unanswered, and what happens in the very moment you stop asking, stop striving, and begin to recognize the divine presence already at work within you. We are learning how to live, not by effort, but by grace, not by pleading, but by listening, not by wanting, but by knowing. Let us proceed together with an open heart, for what unfolds in these moments has the power to transform your entire understanding of prayer, of God, and of yourself. Now, as we continue, let us look more deeply into this matter of asking, for it is here that one of the greatest obstacles to spiritual realization is found. You see, the moment you ask God for something, you have created in your consciousness an image of two powers, a power called the problem and a power called God, which you hope will overcome the problem. And yet, my friends, the moment you accept two powers in your consciousness, you have stepped out of the kingdom. You have stepped into the realm of conflict, of duality, of struggle. Let me say this plainly. Every request you make to God affirms that God has not already done the work. The very act of asking secretly declares, I lack, I need, I am separate from the fullness of life. It is not the words that cause the difficulty. It is the consciousness from which the words arise. Asking God to correct something implies that God allowed an error. Asking God to heal implies that God permitted sickness. Asking God to provide implies that God withheld supply. You may not intend such thoughts, but asking contains them. This is what I mean when I speak of the great spiritual mistake, the acceptance of two powers. One power you call the condition, and the other you call God. But listen carefully. God has no opposing power. God has no rival, no adversary, no counterpart. All that appears as error, lack, discord, or disease is not a second power. It is only a mistaken sense of the one power. So when you ask, you are unknowingly bowing before the appearance, granting it authority it does not possess. You reinforce its seeming reality. You strengthen the illusion that there is something out there that must be fixed, improved, or corrected. And in that very moment, you lose the awareness of the one presence. This is why asking blocks receiving, not because God refuses to respond, but because your act of asking begins from separation. And separation cannot receive what unity has already given. Let me illustrate this. When you ask for abundance, you are confessing to yourself that lack is present. When you ask for healing, you affirm that disease has power. When you ask for peace, you acknowledge disturbance as real, and the mind will cling to what it acknowledges. But the infinite way teaches something entirely different. It teaches that there is only one power, and that this one power is already functioning, already fulfilling, already complete. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be changed. What is needed is recognition of the presence that has never stopped flowing through your life. And so when you ask God to intervene, you place God behind the situation, outside the situation, separate from the situation. But the truth is, God is the life of the situation itself. God is the substance of your being. God is the intelligence that maintains the harmony of your existence. There is no place where God ends and you begin. Therefore, asking becomes unnecessary, not because you should avoid it, but because once you glimpse the truth of one power, you realize there is nothing to ask for. The answer was present before the question ever arose. The supply existed before the need appeared. The healing was established before the condition manifested. Let us then release the habit of petition, not by force, but by understanding. As soon as you perceive that asking affirms two powers, you will stop naturally. And in the stopping, you will feel a great weight lift, a deep peace enter, for you will have returned to the truth of one presence, one power, one life. This is the foundation upon which grace begins to operate. And now, having seen why asking creates a sense of separation, let us turn our attention to a truth far more beautiful, far more comforting, far more liberating than anything the human mind can conceive. It is this: the presence has already gone before you prayed, before you desired, before you feared, before the problem ever appeared in your sight. The activity of the infinite was already functioning at the center of your being. This is not poetry. This is not metaphor. This is spiritual law. Scripture tells us plainly, "Your Father knoweth what things ye have need of before ye ask." But humanity has never understood the depth of this statement. It has been interpreted as a promise that God will respond quickly if you ask correctly, but that is not what it means at all. It means that the need itself is only the appearance of a supply already provided. The need is not a request to God, it is the revelation that supply is already present in consciousness, awaiting recognition. My friends, the presence never begins working when you pray. The presence never waits for your words, your tears, your petitions. The divine activity is continuous, unbroken, eternal. It does not start and it does not stop. It simply is. And this is why, when you turn within, when you become still, when you cease your frantic asking, something remarkable occurs. You begin to sense a harmony that was always there but unnoticed. You begin to feel a peace that was never absent but long ignored. You begin to realize that God is not coming to you, God is expressing as you. You see, the human mind believes that God must enter a situation from the outside, as though God were watching the events of your life from a distance. But the truth is, God is the life of the situation itself. God is the breath of your being. God is the intelligence that directs your steps. God is the substance of your supply. God is the wholeness of your health. When you understand this, asking becomes not only unnecessary, it becomes impossible. Not because you suppress the desire, but because the moment you turn inward, you perceive that everything you thought you lacked was already established within your consciousness. Let me bring this into practical terms. Before the illness appeared, the divine wholeness of your being was already intact. Before the financial challenge surfaced, the provision for your life was already present in spiritual form. Before the conflict arose, peace was already the reality of your being. The appearance of a problem is nothing more than your opportunity to discover what has always been true. And so I say to you, the presence has gone before you, not as something you must call forth, but as the ongoing activity of divine intelligence. This is why you can rest. This is why you can stop asking. This is why you can be still, because nothing you require is ever missing. It is simply awaiting your recognition. As we continue in this class, we will learn what real prayer is when it is no longer asking. We will learn how prayer becomes listening for the divine impulse already present within us. Let us go deeper into this silence, for it is in the silence that the presence announces itself. And now, my friends, let us come to the heart of this entire message, the meaning of true prayer. For if prayer is not asking, if prayer is not petition, if prayer is not persuading God to act, then what is prayer? Prayer, in its purest form, is listening, not speaking to God, but listening for God, not reaching upward or outward, but becoming still enough to feel the movement of the Spirit within. You remember the ancient words, "Be still and know that I am God." This is not advice. This is instruction in the mechanics of spiritual realization. The stillness is not a pause before you speak. It is the prayer itself. In the stillness, the human sense of self begins to subside, and a deeper awareness comes forward, an awareness that does not think, that does not reason, that does not plead, but simply knows. True prayer is the opening of consciousness to the presence that is already here. It is the quiet recognition that the truth of your being is not separate from God's being. When you sit in silence, not trying to get, not seeking to achieve, not wanting to change anything, you create an atmosphere in which the divine impulse can make itself known. You see, you do not have to speak to God because God is not separate from you. There is no distance between the soul and its source. Therefore, the moment you fall silent, the moment you surrender the desire to control, the moment you cease the inner noise of wanting and fearing and planning, you create the space in which the presence can be felt, and the presence speaks, not in words, not in thoughts, but in a deep peace, in a gentle assurance, in an inner stillness that says without sound, "All is well, I am here. I have always been here." This is the still small voice of Scripture. It is not a voice heard with the ears. It is the stirring of awareness itself. It is the dawning of spiritual certainty, the quiet unveiling of truth, the soft but unmistakable realization that you are not alone. You have never been alone. And nothing in this world has ever separated you from the love and intelligence that animates your very being. But listen carefully now. You cannot hear this voice while you are asking. You cannot hear it while you are arguing with circumstances. You cannot hear it while your mind is busy trying to fix, solve, or improve the outer condition. The still, small voice is drowned out by the noise of human thought. This is why true prayer begins with silence, a silence not merely of the tongue, but of the mind. A silence not of emptiness, but of expectancy. A silence that says, "Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth." And when you rest in this inner listening, a remarkable thing happens. You realize that prayer is not something you do. Prayer is something you receive. Prayer is not your attempt to reach God. Prayer is God's activity within you, revealing truth, dissolving fear, correcting perception, and restoring your awareness of the kingdom. So let us understand. True prayer is not a technique. True prayer is not a formula. True prayer is the quiet yielding of the human sense so that the divine presence may announce itself. As we proceed, we will look more deeply at the moment this inner shift occurs, the moment when asking ceases and grace begins its work. For it is in that moment that the miraculous becomes the natural and the impossible becomes the obvious. And now, let us turn to that sacred moment in consciousness when everything changes, the moment you stop asking. Not because you force yourself to stop, not because you suppress desire, but because you awaken to the truth that asking has no place in the presence of the infinite. This moment may come suddenly, or it may come gradually. But when it comes, it is unmistakable. It is the moment when you release the belief that anything is missing. It is the moment when you stop trying to make something happen and instead allow yourself to rest in what already is. It is the moment when the mind finally, blessedly, becomes still enough to sense that divine activity which has never been absent. My friends, grace does not enter because you ask. Grace becomes visible because you stop asking. Grace is not a reward for proper prayer. Grace is not the result of effort, discipline, or spiritual performance. Grace is the eternal functioning of the one presence, and it is always present. The only barrier to its recognition is the noise of human wanting. Let me say that again. Grace is never absent. It is only unrecognized, and asking blinds you to it because asking declares a need where wholeness already exists. Picture, for a moment, the difference between a clenched hand and an open hand. Asking is the clenched hand tight, striving, holding on to fear, insisting that something must change. Non-asking is the open hand, relaxed, receptive, unresisting, trusting. Only the open hand can receive. Only the quiet mind can behold what grace has already prepared. But I want you to understand this more deeply. What you receive in grace is not something new. You are not receiving a fresh supply. You are not receiving a new healing. You are not receiving a sudden gift from heaven. Rather, you are becoming aware of the spiritual reality that has been true from the beginning. The outer effect may appear as healing, supply, harmony, direction, opportunity, but these are only forms. What is actually happening is that your consciousness is shifting from separation to oneness, and the outer world adjusts itself to mirror that recognition. This is why the moment you stop asking is the moment the outer begins to move. Without your manipulation, solutions appear without strain, inspiration rises without effort, healing unfolds without mental work, doors open without planning, because the activity is not yours. It is the divine presence revealing itself as your experience. You see, the human mind wants to perform. It wants to fix, to adjust. to accomplish. But spiritual realization comes only when the human mind stands aside, when it ceases its struggle, when it stops announcing its needs, when it releases its self-appointed role as the one responsible for the universe. In that sacred pause, sometimes it lasts only a second, the presence announces itself, not in words, not in visions, but in a stillness so deep that it reverberates through every corner of your being. And in that stillness, without thought, without argument, without effort, it is done. It has always been done. This is the dawning of grace. This is the moment the spiritual universe becomes visible. This is the moment God takes over, not because God was absent before, but because you finally ceased interfering. And so I say to you, with all tenderness, do not try to bring God into your problems. Do not try to summon God to fix your circumstances. God has already gone before you. The moment you stop asking, you create the space to behold the truth that was waiting for recognition. The next step now is to learn how to enter this state deliberately, not by force, but by understanding. For the shift from asking to non-asking is not merely a change in action, it is a change in consciousness, and it must be understood before it can become natural. We will now turn to the practical inner movement that allows you to stop asking and to rest in the presence. Now, my friends, let us look together at how this shift from asking to non-asking takes place, not as an act of discipline, not as an effort of will, but as a natural movement of understanding. For I do not want you to imagine that you must suppress your thoughts or deny your desires. That is not the infinite way. What we are learning is how to lift our consciousness above the level where asking seems necessary. To stop asking does not mean to ignore your needs. It means to realize that your needs have already been met in the fullness of divine consciousness. The recognition of this truth dissolves the impulse to ask. The asking fades because it has no foundation in reality. So how do we enter this state? We begin with a simple pause. When a fear arises, when a need appears, when the mind rushes to ask or beg or plan, stop for just a moment. Do not respond immediately. Do not reach for solutions. Allow yourself a breath of stillness. In that pause, turn within, not to your thoughts, not to your emotions, but to the quiet awareness behind them. And in that inner silence, gently acknowledge, the Father within me knows. All that the Father hath is already mine. This is not a formula. It is a recognition. You are not trying to persuade God to act. You are reminding yourself that God is the only actor, the only power, the only presence functioning as your life. Once you acknowledge this, you do something very important. You rest. You let the mind settle. You let the emotions quiet themselves. You let the human effort fall away. You release the inner tension that demanded change. And in that release, you step out of the realm of getting and into the realm of being. Now, you may ask, what should I think about? What should I visualize? What should I affirm? But the answer is always the same: nothing. True prayer is not an activity of thought. It is the surrender of thought. It is the awareness that the presence is already accomplishing all that concerns you. So instead of asking, you become still. Instead of petitioning, you listen. Instead of trying to make something happen, you allow what is already true to reveal itself. This is the practical shift from thinking to resting, from striving to knowing, from asking to recognizing, from fear to assurance, from human will to divine activity. And let me tell you something that will free you. The moment you turn within, the moment you acknowledge the presence. The moment you rest in that inner stillness, the entire spiritual universe is already responding. Not because you asked, but because grace is always flowing. It is only your awareness of it that changes. Some of you will find that this requires practice. The mind is conditioned to seek outwardly, to grasp, to strive. But each time you pause, each time you turn within, each time you acknowledge the presence, you weaken the old habit and strengthen the new awareness. And one day, without effort, you will notice something extraordinary. You have stopped asking altogether, not because you tried to stop, but because you no longer believe in the illusion of lack. You will find that your first impulse in every situation is not fear, not pleading, not planning, but turning within. This is the beginning of living by grace. This is the beginning of a life guided from within rather than driven from without. And this, my friends, is the foundation upon which the mystical life is built. But now we must explore what happens once this shift becomes natural, once non-asking becomes your regular state of consciousness. For the life lived by grace is entirely different from the life lived by effort. Let us go on to that discovery now. Now we come to the great transition of the spiritual path, the shift from living by human effort to living by divine grace. And I tell you plainly, the difference is not subtle. The difference is not small. It is the difference between struggle and peace, between fear and assurance, between a life of constant striving and a life that unfolds of itself in harmony. When you stop asking, when you cease believing that something must be added to your life, something begins to change within you, quietly, gently, without fanfare. You begin to discover an inner poise, an inner confidence, an inner stability that does not depend on outer circumstances. This is the first sign that you are beginning to live by grace. You see, when the human mind believes itself responsible for solving problems, for creating supply, for maintaining health, for arranging relationships, it is always anxious. It fears failure, it fears loss, it fears uncertainty. The mind tries to protect itself by constant effort, constant planning, constant control. But grace requires none of this. Grace is the activity of God operating as your consciousness. Grace is the natural flow of harmony, order, intelligence, and fulfillment from within to without. Grace is what happens when the personal sense of responsibility dissolves. Let me repeat that, for it is a turning point in the spiritual life. Grace operates when personal responsibility dissolves, not irresponsibility, no, but the recognition that the responsibility for your life rests in the infinite presence, not in the human mind. When you live by grace, decisions become clearer because they arise in you, not from you. Solutions appear without strain because they unfold through you, not by you. Supply comes through channels you never imagined because it does not depend on your planning. Healing takes place without mental effort because the body responds to the inner harmony already established in spirit. And perhaps most beautifully of all, fear begins to disappear. You see, fear is always rooted in the belief that something can go wrong, that something can be lacking, that something can be taken from you. But when you recognize that the source of your life is within you and not in the outer world, fear has no foundation left to stand on. The outer world may still present difficulties. Conditions may still arise. But when you are living by grace, you face them from an entirely different consciousness. Instead of reacting, you pause. Instead of worrying, you turn within. Instead of planning frantically, you rest in the assurance that the same presence that has guided every moment of your existence is guiding you now. And out of that inner quiet, an answer comes. Not always immediately, not always dramatically, but surely, gently, and with absolute precision. The outer condition adjusts itself to the inner realization, and you begin to see that it was never the outer that needed changing. It was always the inner recognition that needed to be restored. You will notice something else. When you live by grace, you become less concerned with acquiring, controlling, or achieving. You begin to discover that life unfolds more perfectly when you stop interfering with it. You are no longer pushing against circumstances, no longer resisting life, no longer striving to shape outcomes. You find yourself living in the rhythm of spirit, and in that rhythm there is harmony, order, and peace. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "My peace I give unto you." It is not the peace that comes from everything going well. It is the peace that comes from knowing that everything is governed from within by a presence that never errs, never fails, never withholds, and never forgets its own. So then, the practice is simple. Do not try to make life work. Do not try to fix life. Do not try to force life. Learn to let life unfold. Learn to trust the rhythm of the infinite. Learn to rest in the inner assurance that the Father within is doing the work. For this is the life lived by grace, and once you taste it even for a moment, you will never again be content with a life based on effort and fear. But grace is not the end of the spiritual path. It is the beginning of a deeper transformation, the transformation that occurs when you realize that grace is not something added to your life, but the very essence of your true being, and it is to that transformation that we now turn as we move deeper into this truth. I want you to see how naturally, how effortlessly, life begins to unfold when you no longer live from the personal sense of I, but from the awareness of the one presence that animates all being. You do not create the mystical life, nor do you achieve it. It unfolds. It reveals itself. It comes forward of its own accord the moment you cease trying to shape life through human will. This, my friends, is one of the most wondrous discoveries on the spiritual path. Life is not something you live. Life is something that lives you. You are not the doer. You are the instrument through which the divine activity expresses itself. And when the sense of personal responsibility dissolves, when the anxious, striving self no longer tries to manage, manipulate, or direct the course of events, then the inner harmony that has always been present begins to manifest outwardly in ways you could never plan, never foresee, never engineer. Decisions arise from intuition. Opportunities appear at the precise moment they are needed. People come into your experience who seem perfectly suited to the next step of your unfoldment. None of this is coincidence. It is the rhythm of spirit. It is the order of the infinite. It is the natural consequence of living in recognition rather than resistance. You may notice that the world around you changes, but in truth it is not the world that is changing, it is your consciousness. The outer is only the shadow of the inner. When the inner becomes still, surrendered, receptive, unified, the outer takes on that same quality of order and peace. The events of your life begin to carry a certain grace, a certain ease, a certain inevitability, as though everything is arranged by a wisdom far greater than your own. And so it is. When you live from the realization of one power, one presence, one life, Everything begins to respond to that recognition. Conditions that once disturbed you lose their power. Circumstances that once frightened you no longer intimidate. Problems that once seemed overwhelming dissolve in the light of a consciousness that no longer believes in two powers. You begin to understand that nothing external has authority over you. The world no longer dictates your peace. People no longer determine your well-being. Economic conditions no longer define your supply. The body no longer controls your sense of life. You have discovered the inner kingdom, and from that kingdom flows the harmony of your existence. This is the mystical life, not a life without challenges, but a life in which challenges no longer shake the foundation of your being. Not a life in which nothing happens, but a life in which everything that happens is met with the quiet assurance that the presence is functioning right where you are. You find yourself responding rather than reacting, listening rather than fearing, resting rather than striving. And from this resting, the divine activity expresses itself in ways the mind could never design. What you once pursued begins to come to you. What you once fought against begins to harmonize. What you once believed required effort now unfolds in silence. This is why the ancients spoke of the peace that passeth understanding. It is a peace not born of favorable circumstances, but of a consciousness that no longer depends upon them. It is the peace of knowing that the kingdom is within you, and therefore nothing essential can ever be taken from you. As this recognition deepens, something else occurs, something profound. You begin to see that the mystical life does not consist of greater achievements, greater possessions, or greater experiences. It consists of a greater awareness of God as the very essence of your being. And when this awareness becomes your abiding state, the outer world rearranges itself to reflect the inner truth. Harmony expresses, love flows, supply appears, health stabilizes, peace permeates. Not because you have forced these conditions, but because the consciousness that experiences them has awakened. This is the mystical life unfolding of itself, a life not achieved through effort, but revealed through surrender, and it is available to every one of us, because it is the natural state of our being. But now we must come to the final movement of this class, how to live this truth in daily experience, how to allow this recognition to permeate every moment, so that the mystical life becomes not an occasional glimpse, but the permanent foundation of your existence. Let us proceed into that closing awareness. And so, my friends, we come to the close of our time together, though not to the close of the realization that has begun in you. Spiritual truth is not confined to an hour, nor does it end when the words cease. What has been awakened within your consciousness during this period will continue its unfoldment long after this moment. For truth, once recognized, does not fall asleep again. It continues to work, to reveal, to transform. Let us gather everything we have explored into a single, clear awareness. The kingdom of God is within you. It always has been. Nothing can add to it. Nothing can take from it. Your only task, if we may call it a task, is to recognize what is already so. You do not need to struggle to reach God. God is the very activity of your being. You do not need to plead for supply. Supply is the infinite nature of your consciousness. You do not need to fear disease. The life of God is the life you are living. You do not need to reform the world. What you see as the world is only the shadow of your own inner recognition. When you ask, you declare separation. When you seek outwardly, you affirm lack. When you try to make things happen, you close the door to grace. But the moment you become still, truly still, something ancient, something eternal, something holy begins to stir within you. You touch the presence that has followed you from the beginning, the presence that has never left you, the presence that is closer than breathing and nearer than hands and feet. This presence does not need to be summoned. It needs only to be acknowledged. And so I leave you with this simple practice, not as a technique, but as an invitation. In any moment of fear, pause. In any moment of need, turn within. In any moment of confusion, rest in stillness and silently acknowledge the Father within me is already working. Let this recognition be your refuge. Let it be your strength. Let it be your assurance that nothing in this world has the power to shake the truth of your being. If you will consistently return to this inner stillness even for a minute, even for a breath, you will find that life begins to reorder itself around the harmony of your awareness. You will discover that you are sustained, guided, protected, and provided for by a presence that does not falter and does not fail. This is the life of grace, not achieved, but revealed, not earned, but recognized, not forced, but allowed. And so I say to you, go forth from this moment, not trying to live spiritually, but allowing Spirit to live you, not attempting to shape the path, but trusting the inner guidance that has already prepared the way, not seeking outward signs, but resting in the inward assurance that the kingdom is here, now, within you. Let this recognition go before you. Let it walk with you. Let it awaken in you again and again until it becomes the atmosphere in which you live, move, and have your being. And then you will discover that all of life becomes a benediction, a quiet, sacred revealing of the one presence that is forever expressing itself. As you go in peace, my friends, go in stillness, go in the assurance of the infinite, for the kingdom you seek is within you, and it is complete.